Hey, my friend.
Hello, Michael. Good to see your face.
Likewise, it's been a minute.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It would have been, when did you leave the Bay Area?
Oh gosh, about a decade ago.
Yeah, so 2010-ish, something like that, right? So I was still at
Yeah,
Apple.
20. Yeah, you were still at Apple. It was 2013 is when we left. So, yeah.
Right, and I left
Yeah.
Apple in 2014.
Okay,
It's
so it
funny.
must have been probably it was probably 2012, 13, something like that was the last time.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like I know your life because I listen to you on podcasts, so I have the asymmetric intimacy thing going for me.
That's awesome. It's good stuff. How just so give me the quick wrap up and then of how you're doing and then
I'm
yeah.
doing great. I left Apple. I did a series of startups, which were, I believe the politically correct phrase is glorious learning experiences.
Yeah.
And landed last June at a data startup that I'd been friends with for years. And that's actually gone incredibly well. Um, it's been a journey. The kids are older. My son's 14, or goodness,
Okay.
15 as of last week, starting to ask about
Wow.
lessons.
Wow.
And he is a music aficionado. Despite my best efforts to steer him into STEM, he just wants to make music. But
Well, I guess that's who he is. That's
and
awesome
what's
though.
funny though is that like I had this epiphany that he spends time not just like playing his guitar or my guitar until he got his own, but he like does music production.
Yeah.
And he'll sit there like, and I realized like all the skills he uses in music production are the skills I would hope he would learn from programming.
Yeah. So it's
And
perfect.
now, like, well, the only thing he doesn't know is syntax. And in the last 6 months, it's like, well, syntax no longer matters if you can tell a computer
Right. Because
what to do. So,
yeah,
like,
you can just,
I'm so
yeah.
glad I did not burn parental political capital forcing him to learn to write Java or Python.
Good
So,
for you. Good for you. That's awesome.
and my daughter is 12, going on 16, as I think often happens with daughters.
Yeah.
But the one thing I learned about her is that the one thing she knows about her future is that she wants to be her own boss.
Oh, okay. That's
Interesting.
good. That's amazing to know.
Yeah, and like whether she knows what that means is almost irrelevant, right? If you have a
Yeah.
passion with fear constraints, then it gives you something to work with.
I would say so. I think that's incredible.
And that was just like last week. She had
Self introspection, right? And awareness. Like for a 12-year-old, that's like this is who I am. That's cool.
right, yeah, and like this is by like, oh, maybe you want to do this. No, that's not me. Maybe you like this. No, that's not me. And so like it was by the random walk of suggesting things and eventually frustrating her enough that she articulated what she wants. We've managed to make some progress in that area.
That's awesome though. That's really cool. I mean, look, does not need to know what she wants to do at this age because she may do many things and the
Yes.
world is changing
And
rapidly.
most of the
So
things that she will do have not been invented yet.
exactly. The world is changing rapidly. So the worst question for teens, I think, is like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Because it implies one thing.
Yeah, and I was to say, and I asked this question as someone who has not yet grown up and isn't sure what I want
Yes.
to do.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's the other piece is like, yeah, I thought the folks that wrote Designing Your Life said it super well, right? Like
Yeah, I think I
you're
bought the
always
book after
growing up.
hanging on your podcast.
Okay. Yeah. You're always growing up. So it's like, it's not a, this is
Yes,
not a, you're done growing up.
like who do you want to be growing into is
Yes.
probably a better question.
A better question. Yeah. At any given point. Yeah.
And your kids are
Yeah.
now officially post-pandemic and back in a normal school.
They're back into school. They're at a Montessori school. They love it. It's great. We love it. They are
Great.
almost 9. They're almost 9 years old, twins.
So Montessori grade school goes all the way up till junior
Yeah, it
high.
goes. Oh, sorry, it goes all the way up through 8th grade.
Oh, perfect. That's
Yeah,
great.
I don't know if we'll keep them there then because in 7th grade it narrows and so it becomes one class. And twins, a little on top of each other. At the
Especially if
moment
you're
they
trying
think,
to individuate in junior high.
yeah, exactly. At the moment they think they would love it. My wife and I are like, okay,
It could happen.
yeah, yeah.
Good luck with that, I
She
believe.
was she's the planner, so she's like, what are the 10 other options? Let's I'm like, let's figure this out when they're in like 5th grade. Like, let's just wait. They're going to become people that we don't even understand yet. Like, just wait. But anyway, That's the difference between us. So, in a nutshell.
We may get into marriage counseling before this is over, but
Yeah, exactly.
we'll put that on the shelf for now. So I
Yeah.
asked you two questions to kind of frame
Yeah.
our conversation and give us a focus. And I stole these from Andy Stanley, the preacher and leadership educator. And
Yeah.
the questions, and this may be getting a little deep. Hey, we got to catch up for 10 years. What breaks your heart? Let's just start there.
What the hardest thing about this one is that many things break my heart, right? I think that's where I paused, and so then I think I go naturally to professional stuff first, and I think of a education system that shortchanges and labels people before they've had a chance to develop and before they've had a chance to figure out who they are as humans, and it tells them they can't be something, and it tells them that they aren't good enough, and it labels them as a C or a D student before they've had enough time or a fair shake at really, wrestling with something and learning something, and just how much I think it cuts off their human potential and what they might contribute to the world. I think it B hurts their self-esteem in a way that really matters, and I know a lot of psychologists prefer to think about self-efficacy rather than self-esteem, but I actually think self-esteem is probably the right word here, because it's like their own sense of like value and confidence of them as individuals, not like what they can do even, right? It's like it's intrinsic to who they are, and that makes me really sad. Like, these are 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, and I think it sucks, and so it breaks my heart. I would say more broadly, as you know, I've been able to spend some time in Africa and a couple countries most recently that were recently war torn and stuff like that. And there's two sides of this. Just some of this is the child soldier stuff that just crushes me, hearing their stories of what they went through, and just unimaginable to like lose an entire community and surviving, right? And I will say there's like some real positivity that comes out of it too. You talk to some of these people and they're like well-adjusted humans who function, and you're like, wow, there's some real hope. The trauma we're experiencing ain't nothing compared to what you've experienced, and look at how and I said that to a couple of them, like, wow. And they're like, yeah, it's what you do. And so I think if we can, there's some optimism there, I think, buried in the breakage. But a lot of those kids, even today in those countries, you just look at the conditions that they're struggling through, and some of the macro forces bearing down on them. And you consider yourself lucky to have been born in the conditions some of us got to be born in, and the places, even for all the challenges. But that breaks my heart.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's funny. It makes me think. I was listening to the Acquired podcast. I don't know if you've heard of them. They do deep dive technology companies, but they were talking about the Invest the Best podcast, how it's like church for financiers. And the Acquired podcast is like church for entrepreneurs. It's like people come and share the stories. And I realized when they said that disrupting class is church for education reformers. Like, I've added to my bucket list doing a joint interview with you and Diane Taverner someday, because like the two of you, when you're on that podcast, the emotional presence you bring to topics most of us would rather not talk about or are deeply triggered by is my model of what church ought to be.
No, thank you. And I know church means something serious to you. Yeah,
I
but
don't know if
that
that's hard
class
work for
just
you in your context, but whatever the
no,
right.
no. I'm saying it as like
Yeah,
with the gravitas, right? That
yeah,
brings for you. Um, yeah, I mean, starting class disrupted with Diane has been phenomenal. I've learned so much through those episodes and conversations and how she thinks, and it's causes, I have snap reactions sometimes when she suggests a topic, and then I see how she's framing it. I'm like, oh, okay, something more thoughtful here we can work through. And I will share an advance peek for you, and whoever's tuning in. But the episode that's going to air next Tuesday, so that'll be what, May 9th or
nice.
something like that. Yeah. Um, we handle gun violence, talk about something in schools, something else that breaks your heart, right? And we try to take a very different spin on it. We're not gonna, no one's tuning in to me and Diane about guns and society and shootings, but what we do is we after a very lengthy sort of preamble to make sure people don't misunderstand what we're saying, we say, like, if look, mental illness is one of the root is one of the root causes of what's going on, if we take that to be true, and schools are just sort of blindly hardening their schools in response to the shootings, right? So you're instituting locked doors everywhere, and you can't, no freedom of movement, and the outside world can't come in, and all these things. Those are all design decisions as well that you're making on your school. It sends them, and we argue that several of them, not only are they not helping prevent the violence, because there's good evidence at this point, most of the violence is from someone that is in and of the community, readily brought in.
Yeah,
And in some cases, like the locking of the doors actually just makes prisoners that are sitting there targets. So a lot of these measures aren't helping, but they are also, I think there's evidence to show that they could be creating worse mental health.
aggravating.
Yeah. And they're sending a message like, hey, none of you is to be trusted. We don't let you have freedom of movement. Um, there's a bunch of things that I think stem from that. And, as my friend and colleague Julia Freeland Fisher argued in her book, Who You Know, in many ways, this like artifice of school as cut off from the rest of the world is a pretty modern day invention, like in the last 120 years. Like, as Clay Christensen would have said, right? When kids turned 6, they started working for the family back in the olden days, and now we all work for the kids. Um, but, 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 but we sort of, John Dewey would say this: we create this embryonic community,
Yeah.
and we shelter it all from quote unquote the real world.
Mhm.
And Julia argues, I think correctly, that has a huge cost also, because what we really want to do right now, to the conversation we were having up front about, like, what your daughter learned about herself and what she wants to do when she grows up, like, part of this is actually allowing people to connect with people, professionals in quote unquote the real world, who are adults, and gaining experience of, like, gee, what are the different possible pathways? What could I do? How can I contribute to the world? And building social capital in weak ties, in like informal people that you're like, wow, like Ernie, has worked at these startups. He worked at Apple, and, like, I don't know Ernie super well, but I'm gonna ping him because, like, he's friends with my dad, and, like, can I get 10 minutes with him? And he's like, hey, did you know, like, that such and such company, like, hires for this thing that you do? Whoa, I had no idea. Like,
Yeah.
opens up my ideas. And so I think what we actually need to be doing is softening schools and making it a more porous or permeable membrane with the outside community right now. And technology can do a lot of that, to be clear. But um, I worry gravely that not that there's a clear answer for each community of, like, what steps to or not to take, but that because we're not thinking about these as actual design decisions, in many ways, we may be perpetuating some of the things that are hurting our youth right now. We know, something else I think we're starting to learn is that youth, like loneliness hurts and it causes a lot of the mental challenges, and we need more opportunities for connection, not pulling people apart.
Yeah. Wow, this is good. You've touched on all the themes that I've been thinking about in preparation for this conversation. Obviously, education and our own children, failed states and military violence, and design interventions, intentional or unintentional. This is probably good enough for me to share what breaks my heart, and it's kind of a bizarre higher order thing, but it keeps haunting me. It's when I see sincere, well-meaning people working really, really hard to solve really important problems in the worst possible way. There's a great anecdote I heard from a woman at MIT who does design. I think it was systems thinking, and I curse myself for not writing down her name, but she talked about how they go into a company or an organization who's trying to make a big difference in the world, and they say, okay, now the important thing is to understand what is the point of leverage. What is the lever you can pull that if you change it will make an enormous difference in the thing that you're trying to solve? And there's two surprising things that she discovered when they were doing this. One is that everyone already knows what that lever is. And they're working with all their strength to push it in the wrong direction. And this was because they say, people who are concerned about inequality say, okay, we're going to try and increase growth. But empirically, economies have two phases: one where they grow and increase inequality, and one where they settle and normalize and share equality. And the 1950s was kind of an anomaly because America, there was this asymmetry in America and the rest of the world. It kind of broke a lot of the rules. Kind of like the golden age of Greece, the 50 years where post-war there was this deep unity and all these other constraints, which prosperity then destroyed. So anyway, it drives me bonkers. And this is also a good point for the disclaimer. I've been trying to figure out how to warn people about this, but there's the 3 stages of dealing with Ernie. The first stage is oh wow, this is cool. Understand all these things I didn't know, right? The second stage is, oh crap, now I no longer understand all the things I did know. But then the third stage is, okay, now I know what I need to understand. Mm-hmm. And if I'm lucky, we'll get you through all 3 phases. If we're less likely, we'll get you through the first phase and we'll stop. But that means you'll have the second phase. Anyway, but this is one of these red pill, blue pill moments from the Matrix. Yeah. So what I'm going to invite you is to go in with me on this alternate Ernie reality, how I view the world, and we'll see where you end up. So I guess the next question is, what is the impossible thing that if you could do it would change everything in your industry or your field and endeavor?
Love this question. And from my perspective, I think it comes down to something that may sound incredibly simple, but it would unravel everything, I think, which is the use of time. And what I mean by it in this I mean many things by it, to be clear, but the one I will use, just to be super specific, won't surprise you, but is that we run our entire system based on units of time.
Carnegie units.
Carnegie units, exactly, right? We pay based on that. We promote based on that. We assess based on that. Everything works based off that. We instruct based off of that. And to me, moving to mastery as the measure would change literally everything about how we thought about where learning occurs, what is quote unquote formal education, what is success like, how do we think about human development, how do we think about paying for schools and teachers and so forth. Everything would change. And anyone who tells you that they understand exactly how it would all change, I think is lying, because like we don't really we don't really know, right? Like everything. I but I think how we valued time would also change. And in we would respect kids' time more as well. Um, there's certain studies that have been done where they followed a day in the life of a kid in the school, and you realize just like how much inane, boring, just awful stuff is going on. Just waste of time stuff is going on. And forget about like trying to make it efficient. Just like that is trying to make it efficient, and this what it sort of produces, as opposed to like blocks of time to do work and collaborate with others and like see where it goes, right? And so anyway, I'll stop there maybe. Just that's it's a prelude perhaps, but that's the big one I think of.
Yeah.
I don't think everyone realizes how much the system has been over engineered on time being the constant,
Mhm.
and like running everything off of that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. That actually ties in well to what I was going to share about my impossible thing, which
Yeah,
is a good
good.
little history lesson. Um, so, actually, maybe I could just ask you what is your sort of 5 minute summary of the history of education? Like, where do you
Ah,
start, and what are like the high points along the way?
I love this question. You can go back pretty far, right? Because if you go back in hunter-gatherer societies, they had education. Like you joined, for the boys, they joined the hunt, right? Uh, they were schooled in ways of doing things. You got schooled in ways of taking care of kids. You got schooled in, how you set traps, right? Like that. Um, you move into agricultural societies. You move into early industrial revolution. Like you have apprenticeships. Um, and there are schooling communities to do the basics. Uh, but even before that, like the interim period, right? Obviously, the Greeks and the Socratic method, and a lot of the philosophers there. And like I think a huge moment is the printed text, is the printed book, right? The printing press, and all of a sudden you didn't have to learn at the feet of a Socrates. Like it became more widespread, and there's good and bad of that in funny sorts of ways. But we sort of move beyond this very bespoke tutor model. And I'm jumbling this a little bit. I'm jumping around a little bit, but that hopefully folks can go with me. Um, the this sort of apprenticeship plus tutor is the way people learned initially, and we sort of move into this mass schooling world of like we're going to batch kids up, and this really starts to hit in the early 1900s. Um, and prior to 1900, by the way, like 5% of kids in America went to high school. So, this was not the way, if you will. It's developed into the way. And then we've had mass schooling for the last 120 years has sort of become the way. And I think what we're seeing right now is a return, it's like a back to the future sort of moment, if you will, right? Where like apprenticeships and tutoring are coming back in vogue, and thinking about how do we educate within the community for what the community's needs are and things like that are coming back in vogue. And so a lot of these strands that were there are pulling back in. And I think that, digital technology in this case, is a huge driver in moving us toward that, and moving us back toward sort of where we came from. More personalization in the way we learn, more pathways and choice, more um, uh, more emphasis on the relationship at the heart of that learning. I think is where we are headed. Um, Back to a lot of the things that were present early. So that's sort of how I think about
It's interesting.
education. Yeah,
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, I'll make a few comments and I'll go to my impossible thing. So
great.
I agree that early education, let's call it uh, traditional, like pre-modern, traditional,
Yeah, okay.
or even actually, no, pre-civilization,
Hmm.
societal, communal village things. It was basically organic apprenticeship, right?
Yeah.
You lived in a place, and there may have been a couple of specialties, but it was all purely relational. It
Yeah.
was not that personalized. Like,
Yeah.
if there's
Yeah.
a
Fair.
village elder, everyone's listening from the one elder, the one healer or whatever. But there's some. It's very minor specialization, but it is totally immersed. To me, the big um, inflection point in education is the Greek Academy.
Hmm.
Okay, where you see Romans extracting their children, sending them to a foreign place to be taught literally a different language and way of thinking, and come back to become the cultural elite.
Hmm.
That was the first paradigm shift that I obsess over. I mean, there's obviously many, but the first one. The second big one, and this gets to my impossible thing, is
Okay. Good.
is the Benedictine monastery.
Mm.
And especially remember, like, who got the idea of a system where there's fixed hours of the day where you're doing certain things, which I think is called the office, the daily office or the liturgy of the Catholic Church. It was the rule. Like, the words religion and order were invented to describe people living in monastic rules. And what's fascinating to me is, like, I love, and Benedict is my frenemy, because
Huh.
what he did is he did something extraordinary where he built a decentralized system that was self-contained and robust enough that it adapted insanely well across thousands of miles and 1,000 years, and brought and became sort of the backbone of civilization as we know it. I went
Yeah.
to a monastery for my 51st birthday, and my first thought was, this feels like being back at Caltech. Like, there is a continuity between the monastic life and a high-end research institution.
Well, and you think about it, right? Like Harvard and Yale and right, all all the institutions in this country, they have their origins in preparing the religious clergy for leadership in their respective denominations. And there is that sense of like, you're in your dorm, your head's down. It was a tutor model initially. It was not a large class model, right? It was uh there is a sense of that. Now, large parts of that have evolved, obviously, in some
Right.
ways, but
But
there
here's
is
the
that sense of you're going in.
right. But
Yeah.
here's the really interesting thing, and this is the third paradigm shift, is that originally this was just for monks.
Mm.
Like, not even priests did this sort of thing. Like, there were secular priests and religious monks. The idea of a priest being religious was an oxymoron back in the day. And the third inflection point was a guy named Comenius.
Okay.
You know that name?
I don't.
You have to know this name because I think
Okay.
of you as Comenius. And this is like, this is the thing that you didn't get it. Okay, you didn't either. That's fine. If you understand this, you will understand everything about why your life is hell. Why you have these deep yearnings that can't be satisfied, and obvious, straightforward things seem insanely difficult, if not impossible, if not unthinkable. So, the monastic movement had some successes, had some failures. Martin Luther was arguably both of those. Led to the Protestant Reformation, led to the 40 Years' War and the printing press. And, there was some debate whether the internet was as big of a disruption as the printing press. But I don't think there's much of a debate left that the internet plus artificial intelligence will be at least as big of a disruption as the printing press.
Yes.
And I would like to avoid another 40 Years' War. And I may enlist your help before this is all done. But the interesting consequence of that is that there was this incredibly dynamic wave of innovation unleashed, which included Isaac Newton, of rethinking things in the Renaissance and all that. And there ended up being this sort of stalemate or competition between Protestant Western Europe and sort of Catholic Eastern Southern Europe. And into this vacuum comes a guy named Comenius.
Okay.
And he says, and his backstory is fascinating. I may or may not get into it. But he says, I really want Protestant Europe to succeed. And he wasn't an Englishman or a Frenchman. I think he was from a duchy of Monrovia, where he was the last bishop, actually. And he said, okay, we Protestants believe that people should study the scripture for themselves. The Catholics don't. If we build public educational systems,
right,
we can get our people to rally around a mindset and a mentality, and we as a nation will outcompete our Catholic rivals. Okay? And so the project of education was primarily about nation building, not individual flourishing. And it adopted the extractive methods of the monasteries and the enculturation methods of the academy to create a system that would allow the society as a whole to maximize its potential relative to its competitors. So because of that, you had to yank people out of their villages, out of their families, and say, now we are going to train you in a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right? And so this was his brilliant innovation, which has created enormous good in the world and is more or less responsible for all of the evils you decry and have spent your life fighting against, which is why in my head, I call you Conicius. The mirror image of Comenius.
That's hysterical.
And the fourth one, which I think you alluded to recently, is the Prussian model.
Yes.
Because we had this model going, and then the Germans got crushed by Napoleon's army, and it's like, okay, we need stronger nation building, which it is true that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also true that they paid a horribly heavy price for that.
Mm-hmm.
But what has given me great sympathy to those people is precisely the story you told of child soldiers in Africa. Like, it sucks to be in a corrupt, oppressive, exploitive system, but to be in no system at all, to live in anarchy, to live in the 40 Years' War, is far more horrible. And the reason,
keep going. No, keep going. I was about to agree.
As a civilization, over the last 400 years, have been deeply conditioned. We must keep the cohesion of the society in place, or it all goes to hell. And the best way we knew to do that is, I call it the backward steps. I was thinking about this a month ago when we set this up. It was that we build a system, and I don't think anyone ever consciously designed it, but this is what the system is designed to do. It works on status. You have a high status teacher who sits in front, and they are the truth, they're the authority, you just implicitly trust them. It's based on power. If you don't obey, we can expel you. It's based on enculturation. This is why British school kids have to learn 100 kings, not because they need it, because this is the culture. And when you look at the slides of enculturation, how much of what we teach, handwriting, algebra, is about enculturation? And the thing is, approximately, it is insanely useful to culturally conform to the expectations of the ruling class so that you can win favor for yourself and your family, right? Yeah. But the price of that is you cement the ruling class in place. What was it? The little bomb Jeff Salingo dropped kind of in passing during one of your podcasts? Well, of course, elite universities use meritocracies and it's used for cementing the power of the ruling class. I don't know if you meant to say that. I don't know if you meant to leave that.
I can't even. I was gonna say I have to look back at this now. I don't recall. I mean, it's interesting though. Because there's a question of like, what's the alternative, right?
I'm going to get
to all
let me
this.
finish the steps. So it was,
Yeah, finish the thoughts. Yeah.
The status, power, enculturation. I probably could look up the T, but I think the T is trauma.
Okay.
I have this hypothesis that civilization is a very subtle form of PTSD. We get conditioned to not ask certain questions, to not think certain thoughts, and to instinctively punish those who disobey. And traditional cultures have always done this, right? Tribalism is a thing, shame is a thing, and that's the last S, shame, right? In the tribe, if you were in the tribe, you belonged, you knew who you were. I remember going back to India, the neighborhood where my parents grew up, where like every other person was a second cousin, right? And that was what it was like to grow up in a tribe, and you knew your people, and they knew you, and it's like, wow, this is what it feels like to belong. This is what it feels like to have an identity given to you that you don't have to fight for. It is incredibly wonderful to know who you are. It would be horrifying to lose that. And it would be incredibly stifling if you knew there was an alternative. Right? This is the Faustian bargain we made with civilization.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, right? Which is your statement that proximately, like learning some of those skills, be it, history or civics or like whatever it is,
or
right?
Language, right?
Language, right, has incredible
language.
value for that individual. Seems both in I take your point about how it reinforces the privilege, if you will, of the ruling and the status quo. It cements their language, and it also allows some of those people to have ladders into that, and create that.
And only those people
what's the
who are
alternative?
successfully encultured get up the ladder.
So what's the alternative?
So that is the impossible thing that if I could do it would change everything, which is I need to figure out how to build the 21st, or maybe I say the third millennium version of the Benedictine monastery. A system that is self-contained enough, because this is the thing that the reason people do these really stupid things is they take as fixed, well, of course they have to work within the system as it exists, because alternatives are literally unthinkable. And so they say, well, of course, you run this all the time. Well, of course we have to keep the school clock. Well, of course we have to use textbooks. Of course we have to, well, of course, it's just unthinkable. And every layer of unthinking you have to do is like another order of magnitude of difficulty to explain to people.
Sure, to execute against.
Right. And so you need to create a self-perpetuating system that is not dependent on the features of the system you are trying to replace. Right? You had to build something that was, a good example of this is the World Wide Web and Netscape Navigator versus Microsoft Windows in the 90s. So I came of career age in the mid 90s, and in the first half of it, it was like Death Valley. Nothing grew. It was all Microsoft all the time. And Microsoft is now the hero of the AI wars against Google is hilarious and deeply conflicting.
Sure, different.
But I'm learning to roll with it. But then Netscape Navigator, they said, okay, there's this other bigger world out there that Microsoft doesn't know about called the internet. And we can build something on and for the internet that can be embedded in the old world of the Windows PC desktop. And Microsoft can try to subvert it, and they did.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, they had to become the thing they feared, and it ultimately undid them.
Yeah.
Just like every country that adopted public education or the monastic university model benefited by it and was subverted by it.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you say that, because you may have seen the piece I published on Forbes yesterday, I think, was about why whenever someone says I need to do system transformation, I get really suspect. Because I think what they have in their mind is I'm going to take the existing system and I'm going to make a bunch of changes, and somehow it's going to come out with a totally different DNA. And my observation is very much what you just said, which is you've got to, it can connect, but it's got to wall off, it's disruption, right? You create the systems disrupt systems. And so if the new system comes,
Right. Like
Yeah.
you can change your values by joining a community. You can only change your DNA by marrying and having kids.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Evolutionary biology 101, right?
Yeah, and
So,
what's funny, I come from the Christian tradition where there's this
yeah.
hypothesis that 2,000 years ago there was an injection of fresh DNA
Right,
into
right,
the
right.
human psyche. And that's kind of the idea is that, what Benedict did, what Comenius did, what Aristotle did, like they injected a new meme into human society. And we
Yeah.
more or
And we
less,
bought it.
and like we bought it and it's paid off handsomely, but
Well,
there
it's
was
the
a
interesting it's yeah, and it's the interesting question, right? And I know we're getting through the first of your, I guess, your paradigms, because as we run out of time on this one, but
yeah,
the thought that, if you'll indulge me,
sure.
that occurs to me is how much the ripple effects are felt. And so I guess, I, just for your audience, let me translate what you said into like the American education story, like really quickly,
Sure.
right? Which is that in many ways, the common school movement, where they brought the system from Prussia into the US, was about inculcating the democratic values of America, one, and two, to stamp out the values of the Catholic immigrants from Ireland and places like that, and to really reinforce the Protestant values of the founding of this country, right? And
And to
so,
form an American culture as opposed to a state culture.
yeah, fair. And so you have this tension as like a big piece of it. And I agree with everything you said. I think the interesting question that we now have is, can you allow for more individualization and personalization, whatever your verb is, whatever your word is there, but self-actualization of the individual as a construct that also develops a society that has cohesion in some ways, right? And so it's a little bit wrestling with the tower and the square argument that Neil Ferguson did a few years ago, where his basic argument was social networks uh, and subvert statism, and the natural backlash, if you will, is monarchy or autocracy, right? And sort of
Yeah.
trying to stamp out the public square, and that these things actually live in tension with each other. I guess I wonder, is there something that allows us to have some of the highways to the society, or the bridges to society, while also self-actualizing? And then the last thought I thought of, to take it to its like full extreme, is like, you almost are imagining a Tower of Babel, but inverted. You allow us to be our individual languages and cultures and whatever else. And instead of like the thing where like it all gets scrambled and we can't communicate, there's like a reverse translator that allows us to like have these little like things, tribes, fiefdoms, cultures, whatever, and yet somehow communicate with each other and like exchange goods and ideas and services. And I no idea how that works, but it seems like the
Right. Yeah.
versions of that are more possible today.
Yeah. So if I post this on my Transforming Human Systems Crucial Conversations playlist, the sister channel or sub channel is called Datocracy, where we try to imagine that world and figure out how to build it. But I'll give you the teaser.
Okay, great.
Of how I imagine. So the thing you lose, first off, is the nation state.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize that's what's at risk, suddenly you understand culture war. Because people have said, oh my God, we need nation states. That's how we keep from having a time of troubles like we had in the 1640s. And there's two different visions of what that nation state should be, and they're fundamentally incompatible. And I think the answer is none of the above.
Mm.
And that's the first, if you swallow that bitter pill, that red pill, then it's like, okay, what's the alternative? Well, one, you go back to city states because you need to have some unit of cohesion, and the most durable unit of cohesion we have found is the city. right? Countries come and go, languages come and go, empires come and go, cities endure. And it makes sense that like people need people. And in the world of AI, knowing who you can stare in the eye and know as a human being is becoming exponentially more valuable over time.
More valuable, yeah.
Right. And so you have city states, and self-actualization is then in two phases. One, is that you get to choose a city state, right? There's some mobility between them. But once you're in that city state, you have to worship their gods, play by their rules, speak their lingua franca, right?
Yeah.
And then, so that's because like self-actualization, if there is no society, is meaningless because you're reduced to brute survival, right? And that's the Hobbesian counterfactual.
Well, right, or the Maslow hierarchy of like to self-actualize, you need to have that in place. So
or something, right? Yeah, but even more than survival, there's like if you don't have a language to think in or role models to choose from, it's even meaningless to self-actualize, right?
Sure, fair. Community creates connection and models for inspiration, and
there's this dualism between community and individuality.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, the first pillar is the city state. The second pillar is my friend calls it the datome. That there's this decentralized data network, which is like the thing that empires give you is enforceable contracts, including peace treaties. Like we're not going to fight each other, and if we do, there's consequences. You know, one of the big shifts in my thinking as I've studied this is going from a traditional Star Wars American hating empires to realizing like actually empires work better than almost any other human system we've found. And the American empire is an empire, and it's better than most, but it has all the negative features of every other empire, as my friends on the left love to point out. It's like, yes, but I still prefer it to the alternatives until we find a better one, right? It's the worst.
Until we find a better one. Yeah.
Democratically governed semi-democratic empires are the worst system of government ever invented, except for all the others.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that if we could have an incorruptible chain of trust, so we know who said what and everyone knew it, that gives us the opportunity for crowdsourced binding of contracts and consequences, which means we might be able to get most of the benefits of empire without paying that cost.
The transaction cost.
Right. And the third part, though, which is the more touchy-feely part of it, gets back to this idea of church, is you also need a physical layer, which is the city-state, right? Then you need a digital layer, which is this datome, this series of incorruptible contracts, incorruptible public contracts, so everyone knows if you broke your word. And so that there's appropriate consequences. But the third layer is this spiritual layer where there is a thing that we worship that is transcends the digital, because you need some sort of high priests, system administrators to tune the system, to write the protocols, to make these things. And those people have to be trusted.
Yeah.
And it has to be high enough status that people will take on that insane burden for the right reasons. And absence.
I really agree with this one. Yeah. I really agree with this one. And I think this is where America, for a long time, it was national narrative. Which has really fallen by the wayside.
Because, and I'm arguing that that's actually a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, no, I understand.
The national narrative is the thing.
Well, because of your city-state concept, it also can thrive in a different way. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And the other thing that is perhaps why this is so insanely hard is that every other system relies on externalities. You're in a tribe, the fear of being expelled from the tribe, you know, the story of Cain. I think a lot about Cain as the first modern. He tried to have private property to raise his grain, got into a fight about it with his brother, somebody died. And God felt sorry for him because he knew it's an insane way to live, but he also knew that like this is how humanity moves forward.
Yeah.
And the mark of Cain giving him a place of peace in his insane quest to try and change things for the better. I have a deep sympathy and empathy for Cain these days.
It's interesting. I unfortunately may have to leave it there, but this has been fun.
This has been. We should do this again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it.
Maybe if you're
We'll
brave
find a
enough to
time.
invite Diane along.
I'll. Do you know her?
I've